Hi, and welcome to another Rule of Carnage review. And today I'm going to be reviewing this, The Doomed, apocalyptic horror hunting from Osprey Games. Now, I'm going to open by taking a second to say that I really went back and forth over where to do this review. And the main reason for that is that I want this channel to be a place for positivity and support and celebration of tabletop miniatures gaming. And it's impossible to ignore that The Doomed has some pretty significant flaws as a game. I want to approach it on its own terms and sort of go in like with an understanding of what it's trying to do and what its intentions are, but I think that even taking it on its own merits, it still has these significant flaws to it. So I am going to address those flaws. I am going to go through the problems with it, but I want to talk about the things about this game that excite me and that I want to celebrate and I want to talk about, because I knew before I got this I wanted to review, I wanted to talk about it. I think there are things in it that are exciting and interesting, particularly for people who are really interested in the design of tabletop miniatures games, and so that's what I want to get to, but I do have to address the problems of the book first. So first of all, I guess we'll open up with the the idea of The Doomed is that you have a warband in this land, planet, whatever it is, that has been abandoned by a mighty corporation that sort of originally placed you and all the tech and all the things on the world. And there are one or another of 5 different dooms are overtaking the planet and are going to sort of presumably wipe out sort of all life, but at least your warbands, and that has an ongoing campaign system. The game really only sort of makes its best sense as a campaign game, which is one of the things I think is really interesting about it. And so each game there is a horror, a massive sort of terrible monster that you have to deal with. There is a conflict that sets you against the other player. This is a 1 to 2 player game, which is an interesting idea given that it is so campaign driven. And you play through these scenarios where you have to both defeat the horror and also sort of go through the conflict, which is your sort of more standard scenario, with the other player sort of trying to do the same thing. So you'll sort of collaboratively try and take down the horror whilst competitively working for the conflict. And these are all really interesting ideas and I think very worthy, and I think it's a really interesting book because of all those things. It's very sort of minis agnostic, very sort of kitbash driven in its ethos, and it's very narrative in its approach. Okay, that having been said, with sort of the overview in mind, I'm going to move on to addressing the Okay, as I said, I don't want to just go in and completely bash this game. It has its own standards and its own systems, and I don't want to attack it on the grounds that it's not like every other game. And I don't want to attack it on the grounds that it's not trying to be one thing. I want to sort of look at it on the merits of what it is trying to be. It's not trying to be a tight competitive tournament game. It's not trying to be something that you're meant to look for leverage and advantage on sort of every tiny piece. At the same time, it is meant to be a competitive game that is meant to hang together and be playable at the tabletop. And fundamentally, it has significant flaws in those things that it is trying to do. So that's what I want to address here. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the kitbash ethos that this book sort of claims to support and claims to be part of. And so the idea of this ethos is that you've got these horrors, these monsters, and each of them is well outside the sort of the general normal realm of monsters and horrors. And so the idea is that you're meant to kitbash those horrors and kitbash the minions that are supporting them. And also your warband's meant to be unusual, sort of strange beings, and you're meant to sort of kitbash those warbands. in theory, that's how the book presents itself to you. That's what the book asks you to do. And there are two, I think, major problems with those two parts of the what is meant to be the kitbash ideology here. First of all, the horrors. Each game you're meant to sort of generate a horror by rolling on a D66 table. There are rules for sort of creating your own horrors, but part of the idea of the game is that you're meant to be able to get through a couple of games in a session. So while you might sort of craft and build your first horror, you're likely to sort of at some point be generating them randomly. And certainly there's a D66 table to roll on, and I don't know a red-blooded tabletop miniatures gamer who isn't rolling on a D66 table when they get the opportunity. So definitely the game is leading you down to rolling on that D66 table. Now, what's interesting about the D66 table is that it has the full 36 entries on it. So there's 36 horrors, along with their minions. It can be somewhere, 3 to 6 minions generally. And then there are additional 5 horrors that are like the final Doom horrors that you might encounter if the Doom runs away with you. So that's 41 large, significant sized minis, along with, a very significant number of smaller minions, that the game is sort of suggesting that, you maybe want to sort of put together and build already prior to a session, and maybe play with some, and maybe play with, maybe never sort of get around to playing with them. And I know that you don't need to kitbash every single one. I know that you don't need to build all of them, but they're all meant to have a real personality. They're all meant to be engaged with as a hobby project. And frankly, 41 is so many that I find myself instantly disengaging with the idea of kitbashing them all. I'm immediately looking to my existing collection of monsters. And once I've done that once or twice, once I've sort of opened the door to myself to sort of proxy these monsters in, the drive to kitbash them, the drive to build original versions of them lessens and lessens and lessens, because it just ceases to be part of the way that I view this game. I think that it's a real pity, particularly because the idea of the game is these horrors are a significant force, a significant feature, a thing that you're meant to sort of be engaging with and dealing with. And it's a campaign-driven game. So there's a real opportunity here to have those horrors sort of turn up repeatedly, to have their own campaign progression, to have fewer monsters that I would really feel that I could engage with trying to create all of them, and then being rewarded in creating them by having them come back and again and again, building up sort of feelings about them. Oh no, it's the Devourer again. He's got more powerful since the last time we met him, and we only just beat him last time. Oh, the terror and the fear. As it is, what I'm getting is, a completely new monster, something I've never encountered before. I have no particular feelings about it. I've got a vague idea that it's a serious threat because the book tells me it's a serious threat, but I don't really have an attachment to it. And so by sort of offering, for example, these are the core rules of the book, and these are the monsters and scenarios and conflicts that you're meant to engage with. The book is really leaning into building and defining those monsters, but it gives you too much in that respect. This feels to me like a writer who feels as though what they give in value as a writer is more words, more pages, more rules, more details. And that's not always a generous thing to do. And in this particular case, it's quite an ungenerous choice to have made. The game wants to be a rules-light game. It has a 14 or so pages, at most, and most of them aren't sort of necessary and core rules for the basic rules of playing. It's meant to be something that you're meant to engage with very lightly, and then maybe put the book aside. But because every single game you're engaging with this unique monster with its unique rules, you need this book at the table at all times. You need to be referring to it repeatedly during play, which is a really odd choice. It very much seems to go against the ethos that it's claiming to cover. For me, it's like, if I play a game like, let's say, for example, Warhammer Fantasy Battle, I can play that game without the rulebook being in the room. I don't need the rulebook. Maybe the miscast table for whichever edition I'm playing, but not always. Simply because I engage with those rules repeatedly. The core rules get hammered in after, 3 or 4 games quite often, and certainly after a good few games, they get embedded in, so you barely ever need the rule book. Because with this, the core rules that are driving the game, the rules of the monsters, the rules of the creatures, the rules of the conflict, are unique every single time. Although it's sort of marketed as being quite rules light, you can never really get away from the rule book and fully engage with the tabletop. The other arm of the kit bashing is you're meant to kit bash your own crews, your own warband. And obviously, as a campaign game, this should, in theory, be quite driven to being a group of miniatures that you engage with repeatedly, that you grow over time, that you have strong feelings about. However, the game repeatedly throws in rules that stop you from using the warband that you've currently got. At the start of each game, you're meant to sort of roll for the doom that's currently approaching and overtaking you. And on that table, there are several entries that say that you can't use certain entries on your army list, your warband list for this particular conflict. So you build your warband, you kit bash it, you detail it, you put love and work into it. Story, have a name, have a history. But the game suggests that you take whichever units within a warband list that you want from game to game. You're meant to switch it up and change up what one mini is from one game to the next. And obviously with a campaign game, and the fact that units can die and things of that nature, you might be wondering, like, well, how does it make sense for there to be a campaign rule for your units dying, and yet saying, well, you can just take whatever you like and just retake the exact same unit in the next game that died in the previous one? And I'll just read the rule for casualties. At the end of the battle, each unit that was taken out rolls on the casualty table to find out what happened to them. If they are dead, then that miniature cannot be used in your warband in the next battle, though they may return after that under a different name. The rules ask you to kill off the unit, and then you can just replace that exact same unit rules-wise, but the miniature, the thing you've kit bashed, the thing that you've put the time and the effort and the work into, that is what you're not allowed to use until the game afterwards. So you're meant to sort of kit bash a temporary stand-in, one that you presumably don't have a lot of affection for, because you're just doing it until you can reuse the thing that you actually put the time and the effort into. I played this the other week with Mike from the channel, and I read that rule out, and he just took a moment. He just went, well, that's unacceptable. That's crossing a line. And this is the thing. It praises and supports this ideology of kit bashing, but the rules do not support you in wanting to engage with that. They actively seem to go against it. So talking of the flaws of the game and moving on with the way that it engages with kit bashing or doesn't, onto the rules themselves. So the rules are very scanty and very short, but within what they have, there are a couple of significant flaws, and one thing that I'll read out in a second. So the first issue is the AI. So the game is about hunting these horrors. These horrors are like the central threat, the central, thing that is on the front cover of the book. And they are obviously game controlled. They are driven by the AI. And the AI for them is not complex, which is a good thing. It's not very bright. It's kind of dumb. You do find yourself in a situation where you can just soft lock the AI in such a way that you can just kick the thing to death with it not being able to make any sort of response. And you're left in this position where, what do? Do I play, not sort of pushing the envelope to the extreme of sort of getting every little ounce out of the game and rules lawyering and all these sorts of things, but do I just play like a dummy in order to give the AI a chance, or do I write my own AI system, something that's just better that's in this book? And the thing is that this is the central idea of the book. It's about these horrors being these deadly threats, these things you have to hunt and fight against, and a serious sort of problem for your warbands. And the AI just means they're not. It just means that they are dim-witted and easy to trap and easy to ambush? And are you meant to set up ambushes because ambushes are cool? That's fun. That's a tactical thing to engage with. Or are you not, because that's in some way not playing in the spirit of the game? One of the other things so there's lots of little things. There's things like, it says you don't have to play with a conflict and a horror. You can choose one or the other. You can play fully co-op with horror, or you can play fully competitive with the conflict. But the conflicts have all the setup conditions for a game. So if you just play with the horror, make up your own setup conditions. Make up, for that matter, the conflicts have the victory conditions, the thing that officially say how one player wins the game, or how you win the game. And you can assume that killing the horror wins the game if you're playing like fully cooperative, but it just never happens to say that. One of the other significant sort of rules, and something I sort of alluded to earlier, is that this is a 2-player maximum game. It's like 1 to 2 players, and it really does not work in the campaign system, but play with more than 2 players. And while multiplayer scenarios are kind of unusual in miniatures tabletop war games, non-multiplayer campaigns are genuinely bafflingly weird. It's a very odd and very restrictive idea. I don't know that I've ever played a campaign that only had 2 players in it. I mean, I can imagine doing it with a very specific sort of branching story campaign, but something like this, it's quite freeform. It seems incredibly restrictive to say sort of 2-player maximum. So the last rule that I have a significant issue with, again, is one I'm going to read out. Now, a few times I've talked about the idea of the rules that cover when your rule set falls down. The rules that are there to save a player when they've just hit a point where the rules break, or they can't find the rule they need, and they want to engage with your game. They want to play it the way it was meant to be played, but they just can't figure out how. And those rules should, to my mind, be a place of both generosity to the player, that you haven't guided them properly. They've lost their way and it's your fault, and this is a signpost to say this is the way back to the game, this is the way back in. And it's a chance to set out your stall, the ethos of your game, the idea of it. This is the way you're meant to tend, this is the way you're meant to play. And this is why my last review I picked out the one in Mars Code Aurora, which is a particularly lovely one that pitches the game in a very specific, active way. This is the rule like that for the Doomed. If there is an issue that comes up during the game of the Doomed that is not covered by the rules, you should discuss the issue with the other player and come to a conclusion that pleases both the current narrative and the suspension of disbelief that renders your table into reality. If you cannot come to an agreement, then roll off to see which way things go. Look upon your failures of imagination and consider this a learning opportunity. That, I'm just going to let that sit for a second. That's when these rules have failed the player. This is when this ruling has failed them, has not guided them to the play experience that the writer wants and that the player is looking for. And the rule that is meant to save them is an opportunity for them, for you, the player, to look back on your failures, to not engage with this the way you were meant to. You have failed. I don't really have the words for how much of a problem I have with that rule. And if that is a rule setting out the ethos, the idea, the play experience that the writer wants me to consider whilst playing this game, I have a real problem with that. I have a real issue with it. So I'm going to set aside those flaws, those problems for the moment, and I'm going to try and talk a bit about the things that do excite me about this, because there are things in this that excite me. There are things about this that I want to see more of, and I want to see engaged with more, and I want to talk about those because I want to be excited about this and I want to be excited about games. So for now, I'm going to put a full stop on talking about the flaws and the problems as much as I can, because I feel like I'm going to mention a few flaws even with the things that excite me about this. But yeah, there are significant flaws to this game. It's the rules, I don't know how best to put it. The rules here are, they're more guidelines than actual rules, as it were. This is a set of ideas to consider and try to shape on your tabletop, which is an interesting thing and is a thing that I like and I'm a fan of. I'm not sure about it as a hardback premium product. Okay, so that all said, we're going to move on to the... Okay, so as I said, there are things about this game that excite me. So the first thing that I find exciting to see in a product like this is measureless movement. So I've come across quite a few independent rule sets in the past sort of 6 to 12 months, for some reason, that are all turning to measureless movement. A system that generally says something along the lines of pick a unit, pick a straight line, it travels for as far as you like, or until it hits a new piece of terrain, a new obstacle, a thing that triggers a stopping, and then it stops. Or it enters into the new terrain, and the next turn you can travel through that new terrain. And it's a fascinating idea. Measuring tapes signify something of a barrier, of a gateway to this hobby, and the effort and the attempt to disengage with those measuring tapes, I think, is something laudable. And it's something that I think is really interesting that, you know, as I say, I've been seeing in independent rule sets, and I don't know, and I'm sure there are examples of it, but this is the first recent premium sort of full release mainstream, or as close as these things get to mainstream, product that uses that rule, to my mind. And I'm really excited to see that being sort of released into the world and people engaging with it and considering it. I'm a little worried that this is the book that it's happened in. My fear is that when the next person comes up with a system that uses that, the response will be, well, we tried it and it didn't really work. The engagement with it in this book is not ideal. It's meant to be a system that frees you up, that allows sort of freer, greater movement, that allows you to do more in an imaginative, intelligent way. But it is a system that has intrinsic problems. Anything where you can only travel in a straight line, you know, and then you sort of break and something happens and then you have to try and travel again, has significant problems with when you're traveling around corners and around obstacles, buildings. You know, the fact that it takes you sort of multiple movement steps to get around something that normally you just curve around and keep going is an issue, and it needs to be engaged with when you're writing these sorts of rules. And in the Doomed, you can move multiple straight lines in a turn, but you have to take a test before moving the second time, and I'm not a fan of taking a test before moving. Movement is one of the basic ways that we engage with the game, and having a dice roll eventually just essentially sometimes just say, no fun for you, no engaging today, I think is a problematic decision. But it's an interesting rule, it's an interesting mechanic. I would love to see it engaged with in other rule sets, you know, used by other designers. And I think it's exciting and brave for this book to have engaged with that rule and made an attempt at it, made a shot at it. And for that, I think it's worth picking up and engaging and looking and thinking about how they've done it and thinking about other ways they can do it. The other thing that really excites me and I think is really interesting about this game is that it is a campaign-led system, and it's not like, you know, the campaign is a big deal. This game barely makes sense if you don't play it in a campaign setting. It's absolutely baked in and built in that this is a campaign. The Doom system, the way it escalates with the world around it, really means that you absolutely should be playing this as a campaign. And I love that. I think that's a great thing. I think, you know, more games, you know, saying that there's an overarching story, an overarching system, something to continue engaging with, and that's like the standard default way of playing the game, I think I want to see more of. I want to see more games sort of breaking out and saying the one-off pickup games are not the standard default mode for this game. As I said, I think there are some missed opportunities with growing the monsters, and I would have liked to have seen more sort of development and engagement with the Doom system itself. And the Doom system also is something I think is a really exciting and interesting mechanic in this. The idea that your campaign is on a clock, that at a certain point it's going to finish out because the doom is going to escalate to such a point that this apocalyptic event is going to occur, and if you don't win the apocalyptic event, you know, in a cooperative sort of game style, the game has won and both players have lost. That, I think, is something that's incredibly interesting to put into a campaign system, to put into a tabletop miniatures game. I would have liked to have seen that system really foregrounded a lot more. I would have loved to have seen, you know, the Doom really shape every scenario, every bit of the campaign, rather than it's a bit sort of separated out, and it only really sort of comes to the forefront as the campaign sort of advances. But the idea of it, the idea of a campaign, you know, for players that has an absolute limit, a definitive endpoint, I think is a really good idea. And to have that with a progression system rather than a standard sort of linear story campaign, I think is really interesting. I think, you know, the idea of saying, you know, you can all lose. All of you players can lose this game if X happens, and how you sort of engage with that and deal with it and think about it as a player, I think is really exciting. I think that seeing a writer, you know, thinking about what winning and losing means within these sorts of games is absolutely thrilling. I think that it happening sort of in this particular book is... This is a set of very exciting things. This is a set of really big, interesting ideas. Not handled brilliantly. Not handled with absolute sort of confidence and vision. But as a book of ideas, as a book of concepts, of things to sort of look at and integrate into other things, as a launching off point, you know, I think playing this with a separate sort of core rule set and using those to engage with some of the ideas in this book could be very rewarding and very worthwhile. It's just the core rule set does break down, unfortunately. But this is exciting. This is a big deal. It might not look it, and it might have done it in a very flawed and problematic way, but it absolutely is. I would suggest picking this up if you are a miniatures tabletop game designer. I would suggest reading it and looking through it and thinking about where it fails and where it breaks down, but thinking about where it's exciting, where it's interesting, the things... This is a collection of missed opportunities. If you're designing tabletop miniatures games, a missed opportunity by another game should be a very exciting thing to you. That's an opportunity for you. That's an opportunity for you to figure out what was missed and what was failed and turn it into something. Okay, with that, I'll move on to a conclusion, I suppose. And the conclusion here is that this is an interesting but flawed game. As a game, it's almost more than flawed. As a game, it's borderline non-operational. But as a piece of inspiration, as a piece of interesting ideas that are sort of stepping through into the semi-mainstream of our hobby, this is a very thrilling, interesting and curious thing. This might turn out to be a dead end, an anomaly that sort of people wonder about in years to come and never go back to. And some of the flaws in this book might be the reason it becomes a dead end, but this might be the first of a range of interesting developments, ideas. I want game designers, I want the sort of people who watch this channel and engage with this channel to take a look at this book and think about its problems and think about its ideas. Not necessarily the theme, not necessarily the story, not necessarily the background, but some of the ideas, some of the central mechanics and concepts that are going on in this book. And I want them to look at it and be excited and think, I can do that, and I can do something amazing with that. And I think for the sort of game, the sort of book that this is, I want to think of that as you know, a compliment. I want to think of that as, this is exciting. This is in many ways more exciting to me than many games that are entirely functional and fully constructed and that never break down and never have problems. This in many ways is exciting to me than, more so than many games that are much, much better games. If that's what this book was aiming to be, it's an enormous success for me. If it was trying to be a fully functional and contained game that you can just get right out the book and play on the tabletop, it's a catastrophic failure. But for game designers, for people interested in the hobby, for people interested in the mechanics, the stories you can tell with these mechanics and these games, the things you can do with these games, I think this is something that needs to be looked at and read and considered, and I want the things that this is doing to burgeon and to blossom and to have more things made in that world and in that mold, just with a surer hand on the rule systems, a surer hand on the sort of core parts of the game. And I'm certain that there are people who are going to absolutely love this straight up and as is. I absolutely am certain it's going to have an audience that straight up enjoy it. I think that it has curtailed its own audience because of the ways in which it does fail. But I'm excited by it. I'm interested by it. I'm not interested or excited by a hell of a lot of rule sets that I read. And I want it to become something else in the future, in the hands of other people maybe, in the hands of other designers. And if you're watching this channel, that's probably you. So take a look at this book, take a look at what it's doing, consider it within your own designs and within your own hobby, and let's see where it goes in the future. Hopefully it'll be somewhere amazing. But for now, from me and from this quite difficult review for me, quite sort of odd thing, and in many ways a somewhat disappointing experience with what I wanted to be excited about, what I wanted to be so thrilled by this book, and I just can't be. But yeah, it is what it is. And from this review and from me and from this episode of Rule of Carnage, it's going to be a thank you and a goodbye. So, goodbye. Bye.